Bene, buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting entitled Youth Unemployment, Future and Opportunities. Why should we talk about youth and employment, especially here in this year's meeting edition? Why should we do that? Well, I do believe that the title of the meeting is important. The forces that move history are the same that make men happy. Well, employment has to do with this because it is related to our everyday life. We look for happiness, human beings look for happiness in employment. And if we look at our history, when people did their job seriously, employers, employees, businessmen, every type of worker, when they were serious with their job and they wanted to be happy by working, well, they made history. So this is why we thought it was vital to talk about employment here in the Rimini meeting, and we want to talk about youth as well. Of course, we don't want to focus only on the employment for young people, because you know, it's a very difficult issue. We have this idea of young people who have their own problems, so we need to help them. Well, of course, it's a complex scenario, the one in front of us, but what do we have to do today? We must start from the youth, we must start from young people, because they are our future, so we should address the issue of employment starting with the young people, because it is also related to every other aspect of employment and of our economy as a whole. So we want to start with young people because the relationship between youth and employment is the symbol of a huge paradox of our time. What is this paradox about? Well, if I think of Italy, in Italy there are lots of educated people and graduated people, and at the same time we have a high percentage of unemployed people. So why is it happening? If young people graduated, they studied at university, they should go to work, they should have their own job and their own life, but it's not that true. So we talk about youth unemployment, we have a lot of figures. Are they real? Do they show reality as it is? Well, we don't know. In Italy, we have more than 2 million people who neither work nor study, and the unemployment rate for young people has decreased. But it's still high. So of course it's a very complex scenario, and this is why we wanted to talk about this, because young people, they're always the protagonists of every meeting's edition. For example, the exhibition of the 1968 that deals with issues and questions that young people had at that time. And as if you've seen the exhibition, you can understand that young people today have the same questions, have the same issues, also related to the jobs that they are about to start doing. So it's a topic which is quite important if we consider our current society. And we want to address this specific issue today with our speakers that will help us understand what the perspective is. Because in Italy we have been talking, about the lack of communication between the private sector and the public sector, but we want to look at the kind of answers, at the possible answers that we could have in our society, both in terms of businesses and in terms of public bodies. So this is why I want to introduce the speakers that are here with me today. Mr. Boccia, the president of the Italian GCI, General Confederation of Industries. Then Annamaria Furlan, the Secretary General of CISL, which is the Italian Confederation of Trade Unions. And also Mr. Canavesi, Guido Canavesi, Professor of Labor Legislation at the University of Macerata. I'm gonna ask 3 questions each, and we're gonna deal with different issues. We wanted to we want to start by talking about the different phases of that every young person has to deal with when entering the job, the world of work. So the first question, I would like to start with Professor Canavesi. The first question deals with young people who enter the world of work. Why is there such a big gap between the school and the world of work? It seems unreal to talk about a connection between high schools, university, education field, and the world of work. Why is it still happening? Why do we still have this huge gap? Why is it so difficult after studying at high school, at university, getting a job that enables you to use the skills that you have and the information education that you received? As I said, in Italy we have the highest number of graduated young people, but at the same time they are not able to get a job that enables them to use their skills and their education. Why is it so complicated today, Mr. Canavesi? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Okay, I'll try and answer this question, even though it's going to be difficult. The first thing that I would like to say is the following. We talk about the relationship between schools and the world of work, and of course, it's a very complex issue, and it is related, it affects Italy as a whole. I think we should start I think we should start thinking about this issue, because we have different situations in Italy, different figures in terms of high schools and their relationship with the labor market. A relationship which is different according to the territories, to the different regions in Italy. So we should start asking ourselves some questions concerning these differences, because we cannot have general regulations, homogeneous regulations, because they wouldn't be effective, because we have different situations according to the different Italian regions. Secondly, maybe it is an obvious remark, it is trivial, but I want to stress this because I think that one single law, one decree won't be enough to solve every single problem of the labor market. We also need development, a bigger productive area. Otherwise, we will never be able to solve the unemployment issue. So one law won't be enough. One bill won't be enough. If you think of our recent history, well, we can say that this is true, that one bill is not able to solve the problem that we have in Italy. Also, I think that the difficulty, the gap between schools and the labor market is due to some choices that were made on a political level and on an administrational level. Choices that made it difficult for young people to enter the labor market. Some legislations over the last few years that tried to build some bridges, but that didn't manage to. So I think that we are not deeply aware of this gap and of the fact that some legislation, some bills didn't work out. And for example, we have the same bills that were passed in 1949, and they've been the same until the 2000s concerning the relationship between the offer and the supply. So we're still living the consequences of those bills. There is a monopoly of employment, a public monopoly of employment. we don't have anymore a real culture of mediation, of bridge between young people, young graduates, and the labor market. There is no mediation anymore, and at the same time, of course, we need a bridge between young people and labor market. Otherwise, it's impossible for them to enter the labor market, and they end up being unemployed. And what's the final consequence of all of this? Social inequality. Of course, we also had in Italy some wider cultural factors, for example, school reforms, educational reforms, and reforms that weren't effective and that created more and more problems. So it's kind of difficult for me to answer this question. How do we solve the issue? How do we solve the problem? This issue? Well, it's difficult for me to find an answer. I think that nowadays, since it's difficult to have a dialogue with the labor market, and I know that because I am currently teaching at university, so I always meet with representatives of industries. I know their reality, and what do they tell me? What do the representatives tell me? They tell me, oh yes, young people, they know the information, they have information, but then they are lacking practical aspects, practical knowledge. This is what they always tell me. So I think, to conclude with, I think that the problem doesn't lie in institutions. We need to start all over again. We need to go back and look at our everyday life, what our young people, young students can do, and what the relationships might be, for example, between high schools and the territories and the regions. I'm thinking of Marche region, for example, with professional needs that are specific and that belong to that specific territory. So we need to look at those specific needs, and we must be able to link them to university and high schools. And I think we need to work together to do this. University teachers, professors, businessmen, we all need to work together. I am a law professor, so a lot of my students, when they graduate, they become lawyers. The majority of them tries to become lawyer. And today, lawyers always say, oh, we don't have enough trainees. So I thought, what can we do so that trainees meet up with lawyers, interns meet up with lawyers? So 3 years ago, we started a new project with my department in the University of Macerata. Our region helped us, of course. We started a new project. We started setting up meetings between lawyers and interns, not to show them the professional activity or to give theoretical lessons or classes. No, it's a real encounter. It's a matching. It usually happens 1 week before the students graduate, when they finished writing their dissertation project, their thesis, so they're not worried about anything anymore. They're just about to graduate, and 1 week before the graduation, every student can meet lawyers, professionals. They can meet with them, and they have a conversation, a chat together. Well, it's not the solution, the final solution of the problem, of course, of the issue, but it's something, it's already something, and this enabled some of my students to start their professional activity. So, to conclude with, this dialogue between schools, university, and the labor market shows a gap. And I realized that there is this gap when I talk to my students, to my graduates, and I told them, this is how we help you. We help you meet some lawyers before you start working. And some lawyers complained about this because they didn't want to meet with those interns, with those students. And I think this is telling of the difficulties that we have in having real conversations between us.
I give you the floor, President Boccia. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have to say that it is a great opportunity to be here. I think everyone should come here because this is a very positive environment. This is something good for the whole country. And this is an optimistic environment that conveys hope and also certainties. I think a dialogue can be started if people are willing to start it. Because some people may not want to start this dialogue. Now, to answer the question, this could all be about the fact that there's no will to start this dialogue. There is a lack of dialogue. And by this I don't mean that someone wants to be right or doesn't want to be wrong. But I would like to thank you because you make this dialogue possible here. You organize this meeting and you enable us to start a dialogue with someone who maybe wouldn't want to have it. And this is very important because it makes us think of what we are doing. We have signed a new deal about the factories. We are very proud of it. And as I was listening to you, I thought there's a new humanism in the manufacturing field, a new humanism of industrial relationship. And every single one of us has to cooperate. First of all, we should put the word work at the center of everything, at the heart of everything. This word work wasn't used during the electoral campaign, but I think that work means dignity. It is essential. In this new deal on factories, we do not only talk about work, but also about young people, certainties, future. These are all elements that should make politicians, the one who take decisions for us, do the right thing. I would also like to remind you that who governs our country should be in favor of our system, because you cannot be against it if you're trying to improve it. So I'm in favor of this system. And if someone is in charge of this system, they should find a new strategy, not only a new tactic. This is fundamental for politics. Then maybe someone may do the total opposite. But I would like to remind you that a government does a good job if we can see results, not according to what they say. So while we talk about deficit, spread, I would like to remind you that spread is only an effect, an outcome, because international investors see Italy as a risky place, and so they stop investing in it. We should never confuse the cause with the effect. In this case, if we do this, we should maybe attend a course on economics and understand what is really going on. Now, we need to start from the young people and the relationship between young people and the labor market. This means finding, once again, what moved us after the war. After the war, we wanted to meet the needs of our people. It wasn't only about electoral campaigns. Our mindset changed. Because, yes, it is difficult to understand each other. We're trying to overcome this difficulty thanks to the work of everyone. And I hope that in September, thanks to the dialogue with the trade unions, we will take some steps forward regarding the collaboration between schools and companies and the labor market. But I remember that when I was young people were told, if you do not study, well, you need to go and find a job. But I think we should say, if you study, then you should find a job, because finding a job is an element of dignity. Is extremely important for the person. We need to remember the value of work as an achievement. Work is an achievement of our community, of our society. If we understand this, then our economic policy then can really improve. It can help us understand what kind of society we want to build for the future. This is the main question, which is even more important than the single policies. In a very difficult period for our country, we shouldn't forget that we have to work together. We should not be divided. We should avoid a trade war. And I'm using the word war because this is the real situation. I mean, just look at what Trump is doing against China. This is simple trade war. I think no one will be offended if I say war. And also, China would like to use the Silk Road to come to Europe and trade with Europe, the richest market in the world. This really speaks volumes on what's going on. Of course, we need to carry out reforms in Europe, but and our market is seen as something that other people can attack. But I think that among all of the stakeholders, there's a common point. Everyone wants to protect their own companies, their own industries. For example, I would like to remind you that when President Trump says that he would like to see less German cars in the US, this doesn't mean that he is attacking Germany. It is an attack towards Europe, an attack against Europe, because I would like to remind you that a German car is usually 70% of a German car is produced in Italy. And this means that if the US stops buying German cars, then there will be negative consequences for Italy too. So the main question is, how can we find a link between education and our professions? How can we change our mindset? The so-called professional institutes in Italy are usually regarded as less important. There are 8,000 students attending these kinds of institutes, the vocational institutes. And how can we improve our companies, our industries, if out of 900,000 students, only 8,000 are attending these institutes? We need to understand what needs to be done. We are the second most important industrial country in Europe after Germany, thanks to our work, despite the fact that our competitiveness is decreasing. Now, I believe that all the stakeholders have done a good job. I don't want to criticize. We have all been able to start finding concrete solutions and not only complaining. We should not blame one another so that we have an excuse not to act. This would only be a simple alibi, but we should avoid this. Now, as for flat tax, I think you'll know what I'm talking about, but if we hire young people, then we should decrease the taxes they have to pay. This would be really important because this would mean that we're putting society at the heart of everything, an open and inclusive society. We need to take these steps if we want to achieve this goal. Otherwise, we're going to always find someone who's guilty and divide Italians into who's guilty, who's not. If you don't take these steps, our society will be divided, and this will lead to another kind of economic policy. Thank you very much.
Annamaria Furlan.
Annamaria Furlan.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here, and for inviting actually my organization, the Italian Confederation of Trade Unions, which I represent today here. And I'm deeply thankful this year for being here, because taking into account of what we have been living in Italy for the last 15 days, well, being here in a place where we can talk about the labor market, the dignity of people and their dignity in their jobs, well, this is very uncommon. This is why I'm thankful to be here. And we don't talk about labor and youth anymore in this way. We have more than 30% of youth unemployment in Italy, and it's a very serious issue. And I think this is also due to the fact that we don't talk about growth in terms of employment, and we don't talk about, for example, how to create new job conditions for young people. Why? Well, because we don't think about the future anymore. Italy doesn't think about the future anymore. Addressing the issue of labor market, especially for young people, it means to have a future vision. If we don't think of the future and we always live thinking about today, well, it's impossible to help young people, to help labor market, and to help the protagonists of our future, young men and women of our country. We are not interested in that anymore. I strongly agree with the previous speakers of this meeting, because they stressed the fact that the labor market is the driving force of every country. We must think about that. Whereas today we always think about the word work with trivial approaches, especially when we talk about youth employment. And work is not anymore the driving force for the creation of a community, of a social community, and for the creation of happiness of people, and also for a shared happiness. So happiness because we are together, because we work together. Well, this is not the concept of work that we have. This is not the concept of work anymore. Today we think of work and we think, oh, I'm losing my job. I'm job insecurity, precariousness of job. We have made lots of sacrifices. I need to move abroad because I don't have any future here in Italy. This is the idea of work that we have in Italy. Well, and this, of course, goes against joy. It's only a source of suffering. So, today, we need to change our mindset. We need to be brave enough to say that the future growth and the labor market, all of these are our country's priorities. So work has to be considered as the dignity of people, and this has to be the priority of our country. If we do that, if we change our mindset in this way, then other issues that are constantly addressed by our politics, they will become central once again. Of course, we think that we can be happy only if we work a lot and if we have a well-paid job. Those people who are jobless and who aren't paid, well, they don't think of happiness and of a happy future. So of course, job is vital for our happiness, and it has to do with our society today. It is important also in terms of our education, of our skills. And when we talk about education, skills, training, we must make a very important choice. We must ask ourselves, are we investing enough in training, in education? Is it enough, our investment? Because, you know, job is fundamental in order to create a happy community, a community made up of people who are fulfilled and who are interested in the dignity of people. And training is important, is fundamental in this way. So we need to change the way we work on this, because we're not interested in training anymore. We don't talk about training anymore. What do we have to do? We must invest in the quality of our educational offer. We have a problem concerning a lack of quality of our educational offer. We must put together high schools, university, education, the educational field. We must put together these together with the labor market, the job sector, and the social doctrine. And this is what also Catholicism has always taught us, Catholic Church has taught us. So it is clear that investing in education, investing in training, investing in high schools is something fundamental today. In our country, in Italy, a country that over the last 20 years has always received less and less money in terms of education, training, high schools, less budget. Whereas investing in education and in training is the first aspect for the economic and human growth of a country. Not only economic, pay attention, as I said, also human growth. We need a training that puts together the knowledge and the know-how, that brings together the knowledge and the know-how, an education and a training that enables people to be aware of what it means to be citizens of a country. I think this is quite important as well. So investing in education, creating a school, high schools, capable of having a dialogue with local bodies and with the territory, well, this is pivotal today, and I totally agree with Professor Canavesi that I've just met today. Of course, one single bill doesn't solve all those issues. A bill, a national bill that is not able to look at the differences of every territory, of every region, with the single features that they have. So it is important the independence of universities, of high schools, because they know what their territories and what their region needs. This is vital. Mr. Boccia was talking about the pact of the deal on factories, and I'm now looking at my friend here, Mr. Petteni, who joined the works for the production of this deal, and he collaborated in the creation of that deal. Of course, they asked themselves these questions. They ask themselves about the issue of active policies, the role of education, of high school, of high schools, of universities. The problem is the problem that was shown is that we want to be present in every territory, as we haven't done so far. So we want to be part of every territory and region. We want to take on our responsibility. Every stakeholder needs to take on its responsibility to cooperate together, to work together, to be together and working together in our territories, in our regions, in every high school, so that everyone can use their skills. And all of these must be supported by a political framework and by policies that need to think of job in the first place and need to work for the labor market in Italy. So we have discussed a lot, we have talked a lot, but we never had a confrontation with the government. We never had a discussion, a proper discussion with the government. We made some suggestions, some proposals that would be useful for everyone involved in the labor market. And we always had to face the problems of the lack of responsibility given to businesses in their territories. And on the other hand, it's businesses, they who work on their territory, on their region, they know what their region needs, what their territory needs. So it goes without saying that if when talking about the labor market we talk about the vouchers and that's it, it's difficult to have this wider perspective. It's difficult to look at our future, to have this wider perspective, as I said. So, but this wider perspective, this look at the future is fundamental. Those people who are our ruling class today need to look at our future. This is the goal of Italy. We mustn't think of an easy consensus. We must think of our future, of the future of our country, if we really care of our country and of our young people. Of course, you need to be responsible. Our politicians must be responsible, and I add, they also need to be generous. Generosity is needed in order to build the Italy of tomorrow.
Thank you for this first round of answers. We've talked about a lot of things, and all of this is very important. Now, as for the second question, I would like to ask you what happens within the labor market. We almost never talk about the labor market in Italy. We talk about regulatory bills, but about the labor market, what happens, the offer meeting the supply. We never talk about this. At the meeting here in the B1 pavilion, we tried to make supply and demand meet, to make young people and the labor market meet. All of these tools should be important all over the country every time, but we are not doing this in Italy. So my question is, our labor market is quite a complex journey. There are many ways someone can work now. Some people can work for a short time, for a long time. Some people prefer to not work for a year maybe, especially young people. What should we do? Because people my age think, for example, well, these are all great ideas, but they don't take the opportunities they have. They do not take advantage of the labor market. Young people are not afraid, but cannot see the tools that they could use. What do you think? The first thing I would like to say concerns this idea of a kind of path that you can choose. For a long time, we've talked about short-term contracts, long-term contracts, as if they were two alternatives, two opposites. The long-term contract, for a legal point of view, Article 18, enables people to work in the same place, to have a stable and steady career. And so people could also get quite a good salary. When we talk instead about short-term contracts, this is something different, because 50% of our short-term contracts end after about 3 years. A few years ago, with some experts from the Bicocca University, we studied the period from 2004 to 2009, and we found out something very interesting. We studied the contracts. Of course, we took an average because there are longer or shorter contracts, but the average length of a long-term contract in Lombardy was about 16 months. Now, this is quite interesting. And also, I would like to say that some experts have underlined that in about 30 to 40 years, about 50% of the 50% of the professions we know will disappear. We don't know how they will transform. This is another issue. We will need to rethink all of our system. We will need a constant and timely monitoring to understand what steps to take. So this idea of a path, this is a different kind of solution. Maybe we are not ready to understand that our career can go through phases. Maybe sometimes we can work with a kind of contract, then another kind of contract. In Italy, over the last decades, a lot of reforms, labor reforms, have been put into force to try and solve some problems. In 2015, the Job Act was put into force so that more people could be motivated to start this path. We worked together with the European Union, who supported this our job security. We tried to improve the relationship between employer and employee, and to regulate people's work, to make it easier for everyone to find a job. This Job Act has been very important thanks to the Article 18, especially as for safeguards. But I think that this is not enough. It is not enough to change a law so that we can make our laws, our bills more effective, because laws are not only something abstract, something that's written, but they are also something that's not written. In 2001, we did another reform on short-term work. We tried and support the short-term contract. We decided short-term contracts could be signed if there were some legal protections. This led to an increase of economic and human costs. So that we should understand that to change a law is something very difficult, because we're not only talking about something that's written, but we're talking about principles that underlie this law. Then, after the Job Act, we can say that we do have legal protections and safeguards today, even though some professions do not have that many safeguards, but they do exist. When I teach my students, I show them our code. In the 60s, we have 50, 60 laws maybe, and now we have thousands and thousands of pages of laws about labor. So there's definitely a problem of with the monitoring of the laws, of the judiciary process, because we create these many norms to face all of the problems in the labor market. We think that when there's a problem, we can solve it through a bill, through a regulatory act, for example. But we actually harm the system in this way, because people think that they can avoid using and putting into practice everything that's written. We also we are always very suspicious about companies or our workplace. We usually think that there must be something wrong with a workplace, with a company, or with any place that gives that creates jobs. And also there are other problems with the labor market. 50 years of monopoly prevented the spreading of a certain kind of culture, of positive culture. Until 2001, our regions didn't have the tools to face these changes, with the exception of a few regions, for example, Lombardy. All of the other regions were not really ready to apply the new laws, didn't know how to do it. So what can we do? Our government talked about a renewal of public structures to offer more jobs. These structures do not work very well right now. In Germany, there are 110,000 employees, and it spends 8 billion euros to finance them. The figures in Italy are much lower. We spend almost no money. So I think this renewal is something positive, but we should remember that the reason why we're trying to carry out this renewal, it is not enough to organize a campaign that promotes new jobs. And also we should remember that what our aim is, what we want to do. We should involve companies, schools, workers, or new jobs will be just useless. Secondly, we cannot go back to a public system. All of the international studies and pieces of research show that we need both the private and the public sector. We need all of the options. We have an imbalance in Italy, and this is why nothing is working properly. And also, we maybe reasonably created a supply and demand system which is not balanced. Forgetting that the important role of mediators, of employment agencies, they are extremely important. This is definitely something we could think about if we want to make supply and demand meet more effectively.
Grazie. Che ha usato
There is a word that we use which is important. The word is future. I think this is quite important and makes me think of what I've just said, what I said in my previous speech, our mindset after World War II. I remember, or better, my grandparents used to tell me that after the Second World War, we had nothing in Italy. We only had ruins, and still we had young people who started working together, and they gave us a future. We are who we are thanks to those people there. Today we have a decrease of our GDP, of the Italian GDP. We are recovering, our economy is recovering, but since 2008 we have had shocks due to external factors, for example, and first and foremost the American crisis. It should make us think about our past and also about our future, because we can build our future with important pillars, duties and rights, responsibilities and efforts. We've been talking about rights, but we never talk about responsibility. We talk about a shared responsibility. Of course, when you talk to your, when we talk about responsibility in Italy, we never talk about our responsibility. We always talk about other people's responsibility. But the truth is that you also have responsibility in what you do. The other aspect the other idea that I had while listening to Furlan's words was the importance of our spirit of community that we have lost. How do we take it back? Well, first of all, a change in the government's agenda. Our government has been dealing with pensions and migrants for 4 months. Okay, they are important issues, but can we do something more as well? Is it possible to start talking about youth employment apart from migrants and pensions as well? Because our world has now different production factors, not only capital, money and job, but we also have 2 more factors, knowledge and information. job, knowledge, and information deal with the person, and 3 out of these 4 takes you back to the idea of society, because they put back at the center of the society the person, and at the center of the economy businesses. So when in factories we talk about productivity, factors know the importance of the human capital. It's not all about money, it's also about people. And over the last 15 years, I'm sorry about Germany's productivity has increased a lot compared to Italian productivity. Why? Because the policies in Germany had this in mind, had the person in mind, the German person in mind. And if you think of, for example, a comparison between Germany and Italy today, well, it's clear that Germany is a stronger country than Italy, but that's not Germany's fault. It's Italy's fault. We must to get more productivity, of course, also because now we cannot talk about devaluation anymore because we have the same currency. So this element, this macroeconomic element, the importance of the person, is important for the future of our country, and it will help our productivity. So when we talk among all the stakeholders, and we talk about the help that we must give young people, it is a responsibility, a shared responsibility of all the stakeholders. Whereas today we are having a totally different mindset, and this is what I want to say to the ruling class today. The stakeholders are aware, have increased, and they are aware of the difference between the safeguard of interests and the idea of interest. So what our trade unions do and what they propose, they do that because they have the idea of an open society. When they make proposal, for example, of the pact with the young people and of the help that we want to give them, well, that's related to the idea of a greater society than the one that we have here. And keep in mind that we did not invent or discover the Italian society, but our society, Italian society and European society, dates back to a very important Monet sentence. He used to say, of course, politics is important, but economy is important as well. You must think of economy. For example, think of the spread and the influence that it had, that it had on our society, of the mortgages. Think of our family, of our society that had to deal with lots of mortgages. So economy is important. It's important not to say slogans. It's important to say, to take into account every aspect of our country. Because we tend to think that foreign countries are always against us, and that they do not want to help us, that they are improving, that they are performing better than us. This is what we always think. Do you really think this is true? Do you really think that everybody is against us? And that we don't receive enough money, for example, from the European Union? Well, it's not always like that. And as you know, the spread is gonna grow up in the future, so please be careful. Let's try and stick to the reality. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the reality. next month will be difficult. Let's hope the spread won't grow more, because otherwise our businesses and families are gonna pay for it. So the idea is we need to create a new society. We need to look at our interests and the interests of our country and of all the stakeholders. But unfortunately, our country is a paradox, because the stakeholders understood, are aware of what representation is, because they grew, and nowadays politics, it's only about pensions and migrants. It's only about those two aspects of our society. But shouldn't we deal with job, young people, the culture of complexity of a country that needs to face its issues all together, working together, and not through a divided society? We should think about this. This is why, for example, and think, for example, in the 80s. In the 80s, an engineer could use his skills for 20 or 30 years. Today, a new engineer can use his skills for 5 years. Then he needs to update his skills, his training. So I am asking Italian high schools to learn how to learn. Everyone has to evolve. Everyone has to update. High schools must be updated. Italian workers must be updated. Everyone has to do this, has to undergo this process. But we need to ask ourselves, what is the society of the future? What is the Italian society of the future? Well, if we stick to the idea of the Italian society that we have now, well, then let's keep doing what we're doing. If we think of our missions, of the politics of mission, but we don't do anything tangible, anything real, well, then that's useless. We need to have a common direction, a common goal where everybody works together to get to that goal. What does it mean? That there has to be a connection between the world of school and the world of job. We need to eliminate any bias, any prejudice that we have, maybe towards capitalism. I'm not representing capitalism at all, but you know, sometimes we are full of prejudice about capitalism. So we talked about paths and projects. We need to start having a new vision. This is essential. And if you give me 2 minutes more, I'd like to tell you a real-life example concerning young people. I thought, well, I was young too, you know. We tend to forget it, but we all were young. And I remember that when I was young, I became the president of a youth representation in my city in Salerno. We had great ideas. We wanted to do lots of things, new projects. We were a group of young people. We were so active and we wanted to do lots of things. And I remember that the director of that association told, while addressing to the president, he told him something about me. He said, well, he's young, he has no experience. Well, this is, of course, true. If you're young, you have no experience. Of course it's like that. If you're young, you cannot have enough experience. And what I want to tell you about this, and I want to tell especially young people who are here, this little story. There was a pike living in a fish tank, and this pike was divided by the rest of the fish. He wanted to eat the little fish on the other side of the fish tank, but there was a glass wall, so he couldn't go there. And he realized that, and he started turning on itself. When he started doing that, they took the glass off. They took that glass wall off because he had learned it by experience. So don't worry if you don't have experience, because you're gonna learn it by yourself. And I had no experience, but then I was also the president of the Italian GCI. This is where I had no experience, but that's what I become.
Sì, è ovvio.
Well, the issues we're talking about are very interesting. We've just talked about how fundamental the relationship between training, education, and the labor market is. We've talked about what happens when someone enters the labor market when they start working. All I can say is that this relationship between school, territory, enterprises, this relationship changes according to the region, the Italian region in our country. We've talked about this during the first part of our roundtable. But we can also talk about what happens when someone is already part of the labor market. We have talked about the Job Act, and we said that we need to concentrate the skills, the resources of our country. And I'm not going to talk about the Article 18 because after the economic crisis, all of these acts, these bills have become almost irrelevant. What's definitely important is to understand the so-called active policies, which means how can I help the person going from the educational phase to the working phase? How can I help someone find a job after their training, after their education, keeping in mind that this situation characterizes the life of so many workmen, workwomen, so many workers, in our country, especially in some specific fields. For example, the building field, trade field. This passage from a work to another, so there's also this kind of passage with this, which is more and more common. Is this a kind of informal relationship, or is this what a worker actually needs, irrespective of their age? Maybe this is even more important for older workers. We are talking about different kinds of contracts, different kinds of possible payments for the workers, but all of this is not the most important issue. What we should never forget is that young workers, families are left alone in the first phase of this path, which is how can I find a job when public services do not work properly? Yes, all of these services can be improved, can be boosted, but their existence wouldn't make sense without a more complex and general network, without a more general relationship between public and private sector. This is what's important. And also, there's a gap between supply and demand. When a worker is forced to work for some time and then not work for some time, and then to go from a job to the other. For example, changing someone's job in the city of Trieste is easier than changing profession in Sicily. We need tools to boost employment, tools that take into account these regional differences. We need to concentrate on the most important issues and questions. We need to create a level playing field. We need to fill this gap instead of increasing this gap and the differences. We can do this by involving everyone, by working together. Because everyone can do their part, can contribute. And even when someone changes their profession, maybe after a company fails, we need to provide specific tools. And these tools must be reflected by the country's strategy. If we want to increase productivity, we need to contribute, to do our part. It is important to understand whether all the new reforms, all the changes we've talked about, will be reflected by the new budget. For example, take the deal on factories. If we say, wait, we need to wait until a worker has changed their job before we make changes, then everything will be useless. We cannot, redundancy will be useless. And also unemployment benefits. We need to accompany everyone in their job while they are working and also after. So we should remember that we're not talking about a simple job, but about a real person. Then the issue of education, of training, of how I can help someone change their training to meet the new needs of the markets. This all becomes important. In our country, we tend to be very critical. We think, for example, well, digitalization will lead to loss of jobs, changes in people's professions. Actually, have very little to do with the future of our country. People have always used new technologies over history. The future doesn't depend on technology, it depends on us, how we help people. And we need to be with them when these changes arrive. Otherwise, it means that we believe that our laws shouldn't have anything to do with the labor market. If we don't do all of this, then it means that we don't understand the importance of contracts, of jobs. Of course, some models need to change. But we should also rethink the terms of a contract in a more digitalized world. Yes, of course, but this doesn't mean that every single worker, every single young boy or young girl doesn't have the right to be able to face these changes. This is why education, trainings, skills of a man or of a woman, are the most important part of our society during these social changes, because changes do not bring negative consequences. Quite on the contrary, changes provide people with a new opportunity to become part of the labor market, to find their dignity within the labor market. We are working so that other people can benefit from the results. I'm not saying that we're going to achieve everything immediately. But if we do not think of the results in the long term, then everything will be useless. People need a long-term vision, not simple and easy answers that, quite on the contrary, make them miss important opportunities. I think that this is how we need to work. We need to work keeping the future in mind. It means that we need to work for the future generations, for other people that will have to face future issues, and we are working on this. This is why safeguards are important, why having representatives is important, and this is also why our lives are important.
Bene, io mi ero riproposto di finire all'1, ma...
Okay, thank you. So, I know it's a little bit late, but since you're still here, we're gonna ask you some more questions. Please, just try and be short. So, the question is quite complex because we talked about the initial phase of job, then the job itself, and now we need to talk about the end of this job paths, let's say this job path, which is pensions. We never talk about pensions. It's almost taken for granted that the relationship between young people and pensions doesn't exist. Or better, we cannot deal with it right now, and this is very telling of the way we address the issue of pensions and of the way it's been used, for example, by political parties for political elections. If you think of the last electoral campaign, well, they talked a lot about pensions, so it was used as a tool, as a device in electoral campaigns. But pensions represent the answer to one of the biggest changes of our current society, which is demography. We have less and less young people and we have an aging population. So our pension system cannot work, cannot help this type of population. And also there are some people who work more than other people in specific sectors, but we also ask ourselves, well, when you are 60, 65, you should go and rest and stop working. So it's a complex issue, full of contradictions, and important for our future challenges. So please try and answer in 3 minutes, no more. I asked you to try that, otherwise it's going to be too much. Thank you. So yes, it's difficult to answer the question whether young people are gonna have their pensions or not. It's difficult to say that. The only thing I can say is the following. Of course, we talked about future and pensions look at the future, and that's inevitable. When we talk about pensions, we don't think of our future generations, of those people who haven't started working yet, but also future generations in terms of people who haven't born, who aren't here yet, we need to think of pensions as an intergenerational system. So a system that helps people throughout different generations. And this is not granted in our society, because today we pay for the mistakes of bad choices that were made in the past, and we haven't this wider perspective in terms of pensions. Think of in 1995 when we had the Dini reform, the guarantee for pensions of those people who in 1995 was 18, it might seem a fair guarantee, but that had bad consequences and has bad consequences for our future young people who now need to pay for those pensions, for that pension system. The second remark that I want to make is that we always discuss pensions and we consider them as something that has to do with money, as a money problem, as a calculation problem, but actually it's a wider issue. It's also about justice, retributive justice. But actually, Constitution says something different. The Article 38 of our Constitution says, thanks to our fathers who wrote the Constitution, our Constitution talks about an adequate system of providential of pensions today in Italy. How can they be adequate? Well, that's a good question. Maybe we're not able to answer that question. Also because it has to do with different choices that have or haven't been made in our country by politicians. Of course, I'm not saying that we must eliminate the pensions for politicians or people who had important charges in Italy. And of course, because if these types of pensions exist, is because a bill was passed by, was approved by the parliament. So it's difficult to change those aspects of our Italian pension system. We cannot change them. So this is my answer. Now I give the floor to the following speaker.
Thank you. Now, first of all, a very important idea. Our welfare system should go hand in hand with equity. For example, by boosting our tools to quickly find a job, especially for young people. As for equity, over the last months, we have almost never talked about pensions or similar issues. And so this means that it is quite difficult to find new solutions. On the one hand, we, the trade unions and other representatives can do something, but there are other things that should be taken care of by politicians. We should find a common goal and work together towards it. And I would like to go back to the so-called vocational institutes and the low number of their students. As I've said, we can do a lot by ourselves, but we cannot survive by ourselves on our own. Now, as for the deal on factories, we will not be satisfied with simple solutions. What I would like to say is that it is not enough to have shared and signed this deal, because there are two kinds of people: those who want to be someone and those who want to do something. And in that deal involves a lot of people who wants to do something, so it will not enough to say something, to talk. About a third of only a third of Italians know that we are the second most important manufacturer country in Europe, sorry. And also, if employment becomes our common goal, then growth and improvements will follow suit. So we need to find a new strategy. For example, if I increase public debt, and if I also have problems with pensions, and if we do not solve them, we should take care of all of this now, instead of leaving all of this to future generations. We should not confuse the cause with the effect and become an inclusive society. This is very important. This should be remembered by who rules the country, and we should stop pointing fingers against each other, instead transform our anger in passion. And since we've run out of time, I would like to conclude. I will come back next year to finish my speech. But politics should think of future generations and not of future elections. It's very simple. Thank you. Welfare, spread, all of this reminds me the Monti's government reform on welfare. The pension age was increased up to 67 years old. Pensionable age, sorry. Without taking into account the needs of all the stakeholders, the retirement age we're talking about. And they decided to do this new reform because we were in a very difficult economic situation. We were almost bankrupt. The country was almost bankrupt. Just after the crisis and the tragedies in Greece. So why am I saying this? Well, Italians know perfectly the consequences of a spread out of control, because over that period, for many Italian workers found themselves to have to work for another 6 or 7 years. So it is not all about the spread. Even though the spread is very important, and we should also take into consideration these figures. Why am I saying this? Because welfare in our country has often been considered as emergency management instead of being seen as fundamental. Our welfare should also boost and improve equity. It is not by chance that when we started a dialogue with the Gentiloni government on the changes on the Fornero law. We now have changed it, but when we started this dialogue, we were wondering, we tried to understand how, thanks to this new bill, we could meet the needs of 3 generations. At the very basis of our constitution, our constitution is founded on the relationship and on the pact between generations. And our people have stopped believing in the functioning of our welfare. We needed to understand how to make life easier for pensioners who receive a very low salary. So we added the so-called 14th, so another salary. This means that pensioners could pay for their bills without having to worry too much. Another issue was how to meet the needs of young people and taxes. We decreased the taxes they had to pay. Third issue. We should remember that professions and jobs are not all the same. How can a 67-year-old person be a university teacher? Well, maybe they can, but how can a 67-year-old person work in a construction site, in a very high structure, for example? So, third issue was to remember that not all professions are the same. This is very important for our welfare. And it is also very important to remember healthcare, because not everyone's health is the same. Some families may have an old person they have to take care of, or maybe a disabled son or daughter, or a disabled partner. Even in this case, welfare is fundamental. We managed to take a step forward regarding workers, former workers with just ridicule pensions, and young people. After that agreement, we had to face a second phase, which concerned 2 issues. How could we enable people to retire earlier? And second issue, how could we change the retirement system for our young people and improve it? Now there's a link between life expectancy and mathematics. All of these aspects will lead to future poor old people. We need to change this. No one wants this. This was also part of that agreement. Of course, we tried and be realistic, but we tried and provide young people with answers. After 2.5 years of quite difficult negotiations, we helped about 7 billion young people and old people, because this is how we do it. We need to bring generations together, not divide them, and thus hampering our generosity that has always characterized our country. And then came the electoral campaign. Someone said, let's fire Minister Fornero.
80 miliardi. Io credo che, come sempre avviene, dopo le campagne elettorali, dove il tema dei costi non sempre si pone,
During the electoral campaigns, people do not always take into account real costs.
togliamo la Fornero, nazionalizziamo un bel po' di cose, il tema dei costi non è proprio di interesse così evidente.
Not everyone remembers all of the aspects of these costs.
Quando si fanno i conti
They do not do this, and then suddenly they had to face reality.
conto delle tre generazioni.
And when they do it, they need to take into account all of the three generations.
Generazioni è fondamentale.
For us, this is fundamental. For CISL, this is fundamental.
Comunque con una riforma
So, yes, we want to carry out new reforms
fondamentale,
that
non tutti i lavori sono
are founded on the principle that all professions are different, and also
però di quella discussione sulle pensioni sui giovani che diceva nello stesso sistema tutto
our aim is to improve the pension system for our young people, because the current system is way too complex for our young people and so for the future pensioners. We need to improve equity, to boost equity for our country.
per carità di dire bene, le promesse vanno mantenute. Io credo che come
We need to keep our promises, and therefore I believe that
sperando che ci sia un tavolo di confronto
we will take on our responsibilities, and I hope there is going to be the opportunity to discuss all of
la
this.
storia di questo paese ci ha insegnato che
As
quando non
the
si
history
vuole
of this
tenere
country shows,
grandi
when
rappresentanze sociali,
we forget about those who represent
grandi economisti in questo
our
paese
citizens
a
and
partire
our
da
workers,
Modigliani hanno riconosciuto nel 92, nel 93 di aver salvato l'economia del paese. Quando non si vuole tenere
when we don't want to take
delle
into
grandi
account
rappresentanze sociali
those who represent our workers, and when we make choices that do not take into account skills and representation, then the outcome won't be good.
a chi governa non rendersi
This is not good for our governors.
le rappresentanze del lavoro non sono qualcosa di
Our governors should remember that trade unions and representatives of our workers are not something negative. They represent values, principles, because they represent people, men and women.
impresa e ovviamente tra i lavoratori e le lavoratrici hanno grande dignità e grande
And
valore.
all of these men and women have great dignity and great values. So it is quite a huge responsibility, but it can become
Partecipazione per creare un
a great opportunity to build a better future for our country.
rispetto a tutto questo e alla
A few words on the flat tax.
cos'è.
It is not very clear what it is. Maybe it's more taxes, maybe it's companies and no longer people. It's not very clear, but
Qualcuno ci dovrà ben spiegare perché i fondi pensione contrattuali, quelle pensioni integrative che innanzitutto sono importanti per i giovani, ce le continuiamo a tassare al 20%.
why do we keep imposing taxes on our pensions, for example, 20%, whereas all of this could be great for our real economy, where investments in this field could really bring to positive results? Why do we keep doing this?
Per cui più sale il reddito, meno si pagano tasse. Io credo che la
We
nostra
want a social system with high salaries and low taxes.
indicazioni molto precise.
And I think that it is all very clear
Responsabilità tutto il paese, ma anche qua deve
in
dare
our constitution.
possibilità di dignità alle famiglie che oggi hanno tanto
We need to provide families with dignity, and families need a social system which supports and gives credit to families. This is why we have signed a deal on factories for our workmen and women, for our workers, for our pensioners.
Per aumentare i consumi, e cioè quello che producono l'80% delle imprese italiane, che producono per i consumi interni. È meglio far pagare un po' meno tasse.
It is better to pay
e lasciare così com'è quelli che avrebbero tanto bisogno di consumare un po' di più. Magari mangiare carne 2 volte al mese.
We should never remember of the people that are facing difficulties. They should have more holidays. For example, families should be able to go on holidays together, be able to buy books for their children without having to worry about their costs for the whole year. I think this would lead to an increase of internal consumptions, would create social equity and social justice, and would create more jobs.
Io ringrazio tutti I relatori.
Thank you so much. I think it was worth it. We have been talking about a lot of interesting issues. We've talked about the labor market, of course, different perspectives. We talked about training, active policies, investments, culture. We put together the education world and the job sector. So I think we got an understanding of the complexity of the job sector nowadays, but also the fact that it's full of interests, which is very interesting, sorry. And also, we might conclude by saying that our stakeholders have something to say. Maybe those who represent everyday life of businesses and business and workers have something to say. 2 final pieces of advice. First of all, as you know, the Rimini meeting is totally free. It's always been and it will always be. And if you want, you can make a donation at our posts called Dona Ora. And second piece of advice, today, this evening at 7 p.m. A3 auditorium, there will be a very important meeting with Muhammad bin Abdul Karim Al Issa, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League. It's the first time for him to hold a meeting here in Italy, a conference here in Italy. So please go there. Thank you, everyone.